Yes.
So you all can see the first slide?
There it is.
Okay.
I can see it.
All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Bobby, and I'm here in Kenita's office with Martin and Kenita, and I hope you all are having a good day. And I look forward to the next hour together on this webinar and want to thank Martin Lehfeldt for being with us today, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. Just want to acknowledge that Mark will not be joining us today. As you may be aware, he is suffering from a very severe attack of shingles, very unpleasant, so we send our prayers and good wishes. And so David and I are going to step in and try to fill his shoes today, which is never easy, but we'll do our best. So let me start first by introducing Martin. You did receive his biography, so I won't go through all of the specifics of that. I think, though, what might be good to lift up, because it isn't really reflected in all of this, is that under his leadership was when the Southeastern Council really expanded its programming, launched the initiatives that resulted in the creation of new community foundations that really did support the conversion of healthcare foundations, and also looked at issues related to rural philanthropy. And also through his years with us, and because Martin has been a friend and colleague for a very long time, in many ways I would suggest he served as the conscience of all of us in the Southeastern Council of Foundations, reminding us all that as stewards of these private assets that we work with every day, that it is our obligation to always serve the public good and to seek to be more accountable to the communities that we serve, to be transparent in helping them understand exactly how we go about doing what we do, and of course to do all that we do with humility and grace in order that we do not fall into the trap of arrogance that can sometimes be associated with the work that we do. So having said that, I will turn this over to Martin, and we look forward to a very informative and interesting hour together.
Good. Thank you, Bobby. Good morning, everyone. If you can't hear me, just holler up. I'm sitting a few feet away from the microphone on the phone set, but I think this will work all right. First of all, let me congratulate all of you on having been selected to this year's Hall Fellow class. As Bobby has indicated, I think it's a great program. The fact that it can into being on my watch is something about which I'm very proud, and I also need to note in reciprocal fashion that the program as it now stands today is really the result of Bobby's careful architect work in designing it. We had some vague ideas when we started out, but she was the one who really transformed it into the program it is today. So I want to thank her, thank Mark in absence, and Kenita and everyone else. David White now one of the first member of the first Hall Fellows class, for all of your help in pulling this together. Before I get started, I need to also note that much of what I've got to say today is being derived from notes and a manuscript that a co-author and I have been compiling for the past few years. Jamil Zenaldin is the president of the Georgia Humanities Council, and he's a real historian with a PhD from Chicago. But he and I have been trying to cobble together this manuscript for quite some time. We still believe it's going to be the first book of its kind on the history of philanthropy in the South. But if we don't get it done soon, if we don't stop cannibalizing it for speeches like this, it's not going to have a whole lot of views, I'm afraid. But I talked to him last week, and we are on the road toward a possible publication of this jointly with the University of University of Georgia Humanities Council. In the past 2 years, as I've done this gig, I've done a pretty straightforward history of the foundation activity in the South. But as the title suggests today, I'm going to veer off on a few tangents and not talk just about history, but talk a little bit about Southern memory and the purpose of philanthropy. occurred to me as I was putting this together that actually the fact that I'm sitting here in this office today goes all the way back to an act of Southern philanthropy that most people don't know about. And because I've gotten bored with my own speech in the past 2 years, I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you a story about how that happened. It was many years ago, and I had just completed at Union Seminary in New York City, which had basically qualified me for ordination to the Lutheran ministry. The only problem was I didn't want to be a Lutheran minister. I didn't want to be any kind of minister. And that definitely was limiting my employment options. A Master of Divinity degree coupled with one in English literature did not make me terribly employable. And I had further pressure on me of a pregnant wife who was to deliver our first child. Anyway, by a very improbable set of circumstances, I got lucky and wound up on the staff of an educational foundation in Princeton, New Jersey, called the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. It primarily was giving away grants to enable people to prepare themselves for...
Sorry to interrupt, Martin.
Yes.
I think they are having difficulty hearing you, so maybe we should just switch it out. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Thanks for letting us know. The Woodrow Wilson Foundation in those days was basically in the business of giving graduate fellowships to prospective college teachers. At any rate, they had just started a new program that involved working with historically black colleges all over the Southeast. And I was hired to direct it. And it was a rare and unusual opportunity to get to know the South as a Yankee through a very different lens than most white folks got to use. At any rate, after 4 years, I made the decision to move to the South myself to join the staff of one of those colleges here in Atlanta, Clark College, which wanted to start its own development office, but it didn't have the money to do it. And so the president approached Bill Archie, who was the head of the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation in Winston-Salem. Laura Smith, one of your colleagues, I think is communications director there at this time. And Mary Reynolds Babcock, about which I'll say more later, is a remarkable place. At any rate, the president went to Mary Reynolds Babcock. Mary Reynolds Babcock gave them a 2-year grant. They hired me, and I came down to start a development office. I thought it was going to be a brief cultural experience, and 40-some years later, I'm still here. I never got away from around to leaving. But I would certainly, although it sounds self-serving, label that grant as an imaginative piece of philanthropy. If only because it got me down here, and it paid some good dividends. Now, that's a positive story about philanthropy, but as I continue speaking today, you will begin to discover that I have some mixed feelings about philanthropy, especially Southern philanthropy. Having spent, as Bobby indicated, 11 years as one of the public voices for the value of our field, I can always point with ease to the many improvements that have been made to our region as a result of foundation generosity and the work of their donors and leaders. But having also spent the rest of my time in the South on the other side of the philanthropic street, namely more as a groveling mendicant coming to foundations looking for money, I also have some strong feelings about where I believe Southern philanthropy has sometimes fallen short and even continues to miss the mark. Now, last month you had the opportunity to listen to a most thoughtful and perceptive presentation by my old friend Steve Suits, the Vice President of the Southern Education Foundation. And as I hope you'll recall, Steve took as his text a speech delivered to a Southeastern Council of Foundations annual meeting by John Griffin, then the head of SEF, in which Dr. Griffin argued that the focus of philanthropy should be more on justice than on charity. Another friend of mine, Marty Strange, whom we brought in one time to lead a conference on rural philanthropy, put it even more strongly. Marty simply said, philanthropy without justice is a sin, which is pretty strong language. Now, we could stay on this call for another month without resolving the issue of what constitutes good philanthropy, and that would be okay, because it's important to remember that philanthropy does not operate in a vacuum. In fact, if you take nothing else away from what I have to say today, or even from the entire Hall Fellows experience, I hope you'll always remember that the value of philanthropy and the measurement of that value always needs to be looked at in the context of the actual situation. There are no absolutes in the world of grant-making and philanthropy. Now, if you had the chance to glance at any of the materials that from that collection of essays that Mark sent to you that I've written, you quickly saw that my preferences most decidedly lean in the direction of John Griffin's thinking. But at the risk of being simplistic, I'm willing to say that as a baseline for my evaluation of philanthropy, and whatever my personal preferences, I get positive about the expression of generosity at any level, whether it's somebody throwing a buck into a kettle, Salvation Army kettle at Christmas time, or whether it's the Woodruff Foundation giving Emory University another couple of $1 million, or whether it's the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation paying my salary for 2 years. And as a corollary to that opinion, I want to stress that I have very strong feelings, personal feelings, about the relative merits of different kinds of grant making. I will defend to the death the right of any independent foundation to exercise complete freedom in what it wants to do with its money. And our membership of the Southeastern Council has always included a wide array of members that range from deeply conservative to devoutly progressive. Some make only capital grants, others support advocacy groups for liberal causes. We've got one that does nothing but underwrite genealogical research. And I don't think they're in existence anymore, but for a while we had a foundation whose main focus was upon protecting the bald eagle. Now, I'm going to get around to saying a few words about the history of Southern philanthropy, but I want to stay on the subject of kinds of grant-making for just a second. Somewhere in the other reading materials that were assigned to you, or maybe even sent to you for this fall, was an article about 4 traditions of philanthropy. And on the screen in front of you now, there should be a graphic summary of that article by Susan Lively and Elizabeth Lynn. Seeing Elizabeth Lynn today makes me really feel old because when I was a graduate student, I babysat for her. But that's neither here nor there. At any rate, there in front of you is a summary of a very interesting article called 4 Traditions of Philanthropy. And you'll see, look, going from starting at the top and left to right, they include the simple, almost instinctive, sometimes impulsive response to human suffering, the kind of giving that's stimulated by the damage wrought by a Hurricane Katrina or a Superstorm Sandy, outrageous fires, other natural disasters. And then secondly, we have another kind of giving that is intended to advance people and institutions to new levels of achievement. It's all about improvement. A good example might be a scholarship grant that enable a promising student to attend college. Maybe some of you benefited from those kinds of scholarships, and thereby prepare herself even more strongly for a life of productive citizenship. Another example would be a grant to a college, as I said, that would enable that college to hire me to start a development program. But then moving further down, up the scale or down the scale or across the scale, there's a third form of philanthropy that seeks to change the conditions that cause social problems. And that involves an individual or institutional donor determining that it's tired of slapping bandages on wounds, correct the condition that contributes to the injury. So instead of feed the homeless, for example, decides instead to support a job training program that will help men and women to become self-sufficient and get off the streets. Something I can assure you from personal experience is much easier said than done. Chief characteristic of this third approach might be said to be strategic thinking and planning. Happen to find very attractive in many, but not all cases. And then the fourth tradition of philanthropy is perhaps the most unconventional and even threatening to many philanthropists because it involves breaking down the divide between the supplicant and the grant maker and erasing the barriers between the haves and the have-nots. An immediate example that came to mind as I was looking at this chart might be the current work being done by the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta to create an urban farm as a business corporation. All of the employees are shareholders. We'll soon be growing lettuce and selling it to Emory University here in Atlanta. I'm not going to spend any more time talking about this particular attempt to categorize philanthropy, but as I begin to speak about Southern philanthropy today, I'd like to encourage you to sort of ask yourself mentally, describe some of the categories that I've just cited here, these 4 categories. It may or it may not. Grants that your foundation has made recently. Excuse me. Now, Steve Suits devoted a great deal of attention to early Southern history, its rather disturbing record of injustice, and the critical role of the and Northern philanthropy in the rebuilding and indeed the salvation of the South. And he correctly noted that essentially for the first 150 years, there was no significant Southern philanthropy. Much of that time, thanks to war and economic depression, there was no capital from which to create philanthropic assets. Well, I'm going to try to avoid replowing all that ground that he covered last month, but I do want to share some broad themes from that period with you and encourage you to speculate about whether echoes of them are still influencing the work of our Southern foundations. And today we still have vestigial evidence of a time when our region was the home to enormous wealth. It almost didn't happen, however. Had it not been for the arrival of that young Yale College graduates at Mulberry Plantation and his subsequent invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the South was destined for even deeper poverty than it was going to eventually experience. Soil erosion and depletion from that plantation style of architecture was destroying the land, and the cost of maintaining slaves had become so prohibitive that the institution of slavery literally was hanging on the edge of extinction. Here came Eli Lilly. He invented the cotton gin, changed everything, and in short order, large-scale cotton plantations worked by slaves became highly profitable. Well, at least for the 17% of the white population that owned 66% of the land. Very soon thereafter, the South's economy began to match the strength of the industrial North. Cotton production became the raw fuel that not only sustained New England textile mills, but also financed railroad and turnpike development in New York and Pennsylvania, in the Midwest. It promoted international trade. A good reminder, by the way, that many Southerners, but many Northerners also reaped the economic benefits of slavery. By 1850, harvested cotton accounted for 41% of the world's supply and 55% of our country's international exports. More than half of the richest 1% of the U.S. population on the eve of the Civil War lived in the South. And let it be noted in fairness that rich white Southerners were not without generosity. They didn't have foundations as we know them today, but they contributed generously. And the names are evident all over the landscape to the establishment of churches, colleges, theological seminaries. They underwrote the building of orphanages and otherwise helped to improve the educational and cultural amenities for themselves and some of the other members of the white population who belonged to their class. There were, to be sure, some Southern slave owners who wrestled mightily with the ethical, theological challenges that slavery posed to their consciences, but they saw no way to change a distinctly regional way of life, and others simply became adept at finding biblical texts to justify the institution of slavery, both to themselves and to the chattel that they sought to convert to Christianity. Well, even as Southern wealth was flourishing and making possible the introduction of culture and art and education to some portions and strata of the region, it's significant to note what was going on in the North and Midwest during the same period. And what I'm going to describe in the next few lines simply, with notable exceptions, did not cross into the South. First of all, there were these social movements that sought the perfection of society and humankind. All kinds of political and egalitarian reforms were underway. They included the formation of utopian communities, efforts to expand the electoral franchise to people without property, and improvements in child welfare and in penal systems. Especially far-reaching were the feminist sentiments that found a voice at the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, New York, as well as the push to establish universal compulsory education. As I say, with notable exceptions, these social movements barely touched the South, nor did the vast wave of immigration that was flooding the Northeast and the Midwest. Throughout the nation at this period, religious revivalism was a significant place, but it played out very differently in the North and the South. The second great awakening that burned across the North sought the reform of society. By contrast, the revivalism that swept the South emphasized personal rather than social salvation. Protestantism, as I've already noted, often served as a keystone for the defense of slavery. Generally speaking, while progressive movements sought to broaden the benefit of liberty to all of society, the leaders of the South, whose survival depended upon social inequity, devoted most of their energy to suppressing one-third of the region's population and then rationalizing that suppression. In short, was that the building of an American democracy was coming to a fork in the road, seeming inevitability the two emerging models bound to diverge. Some of you heard me speak in Charleston back in the fall, may have heard me give this profound illustration of that growing divide in 1836 when a fellow named James Smithson left a bequest for the founding of an institution, the increase in diffusion of knowledge, you know today as the Smithsonian in Washington. Well, Congress was debating the legality of the federal government even accepting the bequest, and Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina vigorously opposed it in the Senate. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts was defending it. The Smithson bequest was an example of modern benevolence fused creatively with government. Calhoun saw it's between philanthropy and government, especially national government, threatening empowerment of a special interest. So he said the Smithson bequest front to the true impulse of charity, which he saw as personal and private. An example of the conflict that was going to continue to intensify. On the one hand, you had the North urbanizing, becoming more democratic, sprouting these voluntary associations, new types of philanthropy, all sorts of reform movements, and the South was insistently remaining agrarian, hierarchical, and communal. Charity, broadly speaking in this region, was one's personal duty to family and neighbors, and Southerners were acutely aware and defensive about the difference actions in which each society was moving. So infuriated by the rising clamor for the abolition of slavery, they went on the offensive, and Calhoun stood up again in the Senate in 1837. And while his predecessors for years had conceded that slavery was a necessary evil, he took the argument to a new level, arguing instead that slavery was a positive good. And the brush stroke with which he painted plantation life basically illustrated an intimate community whose members, both black and white, were bound to each other by ties of mutual, not just obligation, but affection. Turned the hierarchy of Southern society into a symbol of Christian charity, overseen by the male household head, the plantation owner, and the master, usually one and the same person. And from this vantage point, the Southern way of life was more humane, he insisted, than the wage slavery of the North, the alienation that he saw as the hallmark of capitalism, capitalistic Yankeedom. In a nutshell, Calhoun's thesis was that Southerners took care of their own, which you have to admit may be philanthropic, but it was a rather truncated version of what we would call philanthropy today. And so Southerners were learning to live with a schizophrenia that made it possible for them to embrace some modern cultural conventions while holding fast to a quasi-feudal concept. of social hierarchy, to stay agrarian while some individuals became merchant princes, and to contribute to the dynamism of the New World while still espousing affinities for the so-called Old World values of family, honor, and chivalry. Well, to maintain that way of life was going to require the expansion of slavery into the new states and territories, and things just went to hell, as we all know. By 1865, the states that had been vital economic partners in the American growth had found themselves defeated by the total war that the North had waged, and by the time Lee signed the surrender documents at Appomattox, the South was in psychological, emotional, and physical ruin. Steve Stut's presentation last night spelled out the failure of the South to come to terms with this new situation. And so I'm not going to go over the history of George Peabody and John Slater and the work of the Freedmen's Bureau and church denominations to change it. Henry Grady, the entrepreneurial newspaperman from bustling and business-hungry Atlanta, tried to make the case that a new South was emerging, but he and others were really fighting a losing battle because, in short order, Reconstruction came to an end and the whole era of Jim Crow began.
Can I step in for a
Yes.
minute? Everyone, we have not advanced the slide yet. We will go to the next slide. He's just giving a history before we go on to the next slide. Also, just as a reminder, please mute *6 to minimize any background noise and *7 to unmute if you want to speak.
In the title page of today's talk, I use the word memory, and I want to just note in passing that history and the memory of history are big deals in Southern culture, as some of you know very well, even when the memory of that history is inaccurate. Ancestry and family also play important roles, and small wonder that William Faulkner, in his book Requiem for a Nun, was able to write those memorable lines about the South, past not being dead because it wasn't even past. And no time was that more true than right after the Civil War. Well, during those early years after the war, a historical invention surfaced that was known as the lost cause. And that was a new euphemism for the war between the states. It was nurtured and promoted strongly by many white Southern women and members of the clergy in a very deliberate fashion, and it rapidly became a cultural religion, successfully sought to proclaim the age-old knightly virtues of Southern honor and valor as the true and lasting legacies from the period that preceded the recent unpleasantness, as it was known. And not surprisingly, Sir Walter Scott was one of the best read authors in those days. At any rate, according to this interpretation, not slavery, but northern aggression was the cause of the war, and the antebellum years had actually been marked by Southern racial concord and opulence, which was now being resurrected. And that theme probably reached its strongest articulation in 1939, when the opening lines in the film version of Gone with the Wind described the Old South as a place of cavaliers and cotton fields where gallantry took its last bow. I happened to watch that the other night on television. Well, I want to jump ahead myself. As you see, I've got a new slide up there about dominant Southern memories. I'm going to editorialize a bit something. This is not from the manuscript of the book. But the lost cause was not the only myth with which the South unnecessarily crippled itself for far too long. And if you look at the screen, I'm going to point to a series of so-called memories that can be still found floating around the region, some more intently than others. So the first one, the lost cause, and the war, the northern aggression. Reconstruction would actually, at one point, had a point of working, is regarded, and still regarded in many places, as a season of federal occupation and the imposition of unwanted national legislation. The glory days, the new glory days, were the period where white rights and state rights reemerged as dominant. Yes, there was that horrible period of enormous economic depression, which was really brought on by factors outside the region. And then we had the glorious period from 1933 to 45 of new Southern capital. no mention is made, although I'll make mention of it later, of the importance of federal infusion of funds that helped bring that about. And then back to the 50s, the imposition of unwanted federal judicial rulings and legislation. The modern civil rights movement, in too many quarters, is still interpreting something that brought about changes which would have happened on their own if people had just been patient, and so on and so forth. Southerners are good storytellers. We pride ourselves on that, but we have also managed to rewrite history to our own purposes many times. At any rate, I want to go back now to right after the war, after Reconstruction, attempts, if you'll put up, I think the next slide can go up now. Yeah, I'll get to that very quickly. At any rate, Steve covered a lot of this last year, the period from the 1865 to the end of the century, a period when other progressive movements in the country were moving forward beautifully, but not in the South. And we come to the beginning of the 20th century, and there on the top left you see reference to the General Education Board. It's an organization, a foundation, if you will, founded by John Rockefeller that gets very little attention these days. And I just want to say a couple words about it because I think it was one of the most important philanthropic enterprises ever to affect the South. It was created to support higher education and medical education nationally. It spent millions of dollars, though, to help eradicate bookworm in the South, which made it possible for kids to go to school on a regular basis. It established the county agent system of American agriculture. It linked agricultural research with practice in the field. And it provided great support to both black and white rural education. Years later, some critics have claimed that it was too quick to encourage passivity and submissiveness to the ruling elite. It did not focus upon the liberal arts education. It was more interested in practical education. I'm not even going to go into that debate. My point is simply that it probably was, before the coming of federal funding, it was one of the major foundation efforts that saved this region. At any rate, let me switch back to Southern-based foundations. As far as we've been able to determine, the very first formal foundation to be founded in the South in 1912 was the Field Cooperative Association. Primary interest was on giving individual scholarships. It was started in Tennessee, moved to Mississippi, and eventually became a self-perpetuating, revolving educational loan fund. Still going on. It was to be Mississippi's primary philanthropic claim to fame for a long time because in 1890, the state legislature banned married people from leaving more than one-third of their estates to charity. It was a crippling blow to the state because it wasn't reversed until 1988. Why would Mississippi pass a law like that? Well, some unscrupulous clergymen had become very adept at going around encouraging people to sign over bequests on their deathbeds to their personally churches and other institutions, and as a result, money did not find its way into foundations and things of that sort. All right, the first Southern Community Foundation came into being in 1919. Anybody want to take a guess at what that was? Well, it was the Winston-Salem Foundation with, I think, an initial grant of $1,000. The second community foundation didn't come along until 1943, and that was the Spartanburg County Foundation. The South was very poor. During that era, the first major foundation in the South was created by Buck Duke, who created the Duke Endowment with a $40 million gift in 1924. Just imagine what that amounted to in terms of today's cash. What that $40 million in 1924. He died less than a year after that, and his will left an additional $67 million to the endowment. It would be a long while with the Depression coming before any further systematic foundation creation occurred in our region. For the longest time, the single enduring demographic characteristic of the South during this period was outmigration. Whites and blacks were pouring out of the region. The South was drained of much of its talent, Obviously, African Americans got out as soon as slavery was over as quick as they could. That peaked during the World War I period, but almost an equal number of whites were pulling off the land where sharecropping was bankrupting them, driving them into hopeless poverty. Between 1900 and 1930, 3.3 million whites left the region, enormous amount of out-migration. No portion of the U.S. was more crushed by the Great Depression, which came in 29, than the South. At that time, population in this region was 69% rural, hard to imagine today. The poverty was just complete. It was physical, psychological, spiritual, as well as economic. And in 1938, a special commission appointed by Franklin Roosevelt came back and reported that the number one economic challenge to the country was the South, not urban poverty in Atlanta or Washington or rural poverty in Alabama. The South was the biggest challenge to the economic survival of the United States. There were still leaders in the South who fought for all that was good and true and beautiful, but they had very little with which to work. Certainly very little money. And what Great Depression in retrospect can be shown to have accomplished was finally to set in motion a series of steps that brought maybe the first true reconstruction of the area. Under Franklin Roosevelt, who started coming to Warm Springs, Georgia, and began to see what rural poverty looked like for the first time, federal funds began to pour into this area. And so we began to see rural electrification, public works, transportation projects, new roads, agricultural improvements, support for farmers, and so on. Northern philanthropy still hadn't left the South, and while Northern philanthropists had to make compromises with Jim Crow, there were some important social changes that were being promoted. The New World Foundation helped to establish the Highlander School in eastern Tennessee during this period. That's famous these days because Rosa Parks, she of Montgomery bus boycott fame, went there to learn how to be an effective organizer. And Dr. King also studied there for a while. With the recession, with the Depression coming to an end, thanks to the New Deal, World War II came upon us. And that did more than anything else to transform our region. It channeled billions of federal dollars into the region. Naval shipyards and ports came out of that, military bases, training facilities for the Army, infantry, and aviation cadets. Steel production, synthetic rubber, tin, all of these things were going on in the South. It was the most important change since the Civil War. And now we began to see new capital being formed in the South. Led by the marketing of genius and Robert Woodruff, the Coca-Cola Company spawned a network of bottlers in the region and began its international expansion. The multiplier effect of that soft drink product is almost incalculable. Early investments by individuals in Georgia created personal fortunes and led in turn to some of our state's largest foundations. Every Coca-Cola bottling franchise became a virtual license to print money. And so many of the bottlers in places where some of you are operating, like Chattanooga and Columbus and New Orleans and other southern cities, established major foundations to serve those communities. Mr. Woodruff created his own philanthropy, Freemore Foundation, simply Robert spelled backwards. That today is now the Robert Woodruff Foundation. It and the Duke jockey for position as the largest foundation in the South, depending on where their investments are taking them. And even today, the portfolios of many of Atlanta's foundations and other southern foundations include Coca-Cola stock that was purchased decades ago and continued to enrich the philanthropic landscape. During this period, modernized textile manufacturing took place throughout the Piedmont, and so we saw that going on. The tobacco industry in Virginia and the Carolinas became profitable, and the Black Belt whose name came from the soil, not from the pigmentation of anybody's skin, switched from growing cotton to raising peanuts and eventually soybeans. You had the petrochemical industries in Texas and Louisiana starting to take off. By 1955, half of the country's oil production was coming from them, and then Florida's vacation industry began to boom. I notice that one of the foundations in our group today is the Relgolf Foundation. I stared at that for the longest time, and then it finally dawned on me that is Flagler spelled backwards. And, of course, Flagler name was big in the development of Florida during the 40s, 50s, and beyond. Now, such organized Southern philanthropy as did exist during the 40s and 50s was tightly bound to the fortunes of that relatively small number of families who learned how to make money in those three distinctly Southern businesses: textiles, tobacco, timber, and carbonated beverages. One was the Reynolds family of North Carolina, who, like Duke, built its initial wealth from the growing packaging and marketing of tobacco products. And that wealth created important foundations that are still with us today. K.P. Reynolds, represented in this year's class by Ian Benton Clark, Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, Sapelo Foundation, and Mary Reynolds Babcock, which I've already mentioned. And all of those belong in the decidedly progressive camp, with what I would label as very imaginative grant-making and leadership. I want to spend just a few moments very briefly on textile manufacturing and the foundations that it led to. Textile manufacturing became to the post-1900 South what the growing of cotton had been to the 19th century. Southern textile mills predated the Civil War, but it was not until after the war that the industry began to became the region's single largest industrial employer, drawing upon a vast labor force of unemployed white families who left the mountains and sharecropping on the flatlands to find employment. The first significant textile-based foundation was the Graniteville Foundation, established in South Carolina in 41, over in eastern Carolina toward Charleston, or outside, kind of near Aiken, South Carolina. A year after its formation, Jim Self, the head of Greenwood Mills in the South Carolina town of the same name, incorporated what is now the Self Family Foundation. Same year, 42, that colorful ex-military pilot Colonel Elliott Springs created the Springs Foundation in Fort Mill. Charles Cannon started the Cannon Foundation in Concord, Callaway Foundation here in Georgia, Hamrick Mills, Avenue Mills. It went on and on. I don't know why this all happened at the same time. I have my theories, and I've got my spies trying to do some research. I do know that these textile barons were great buddies, and they did get together informally, just by themselves with no staff, at the Grove Park Inn once a year, where they would sip a little bourbon and talk a little business. And I'm convinced that they all kind of shook hands one day and said, hey, why don't we start a foundation, some foundations. I wish I'd known Elliott Springs, who rarely did anything in a small way and seems to have usually had fun doing it. One of his family holdings recently sold was a 29-mile railroad spur on the Lancaster and Chester Railroad. And so he appointed 29 vice presidents to the railway, one for each mile of track. And they included golfer Bobby Jones and playwright Charles MacArthur and radio newscaster Lowell Thomas and other friends. And then what got the most national attention was when he appointed Gypsy Rose Lee, who was the country's most famous striptease artist, as vice president in charge of unveiling. And what a grand time he had. But they were all remarkably generous. It may have been a paternalistic form of giving. You'd have to take a look at each of the grants they made. Some said they simply gave to give back to the community and help make them rich. But they were a colorful lot. They were not without generosity, and their impact continues to this day, whether it was altruistic or a sense of noblesse oblige. And throughout the region, there were other leaders like that. James Graham Brown in Louisville, Kentucky, who left a large foundation to serve his city and state in Louisville. A.H. Robbins in Richmond, Arthur Binding Davis in Florida. He actually had made his first fortune in aluminum, retired to Florida, got bored, made another fortune in real estate, and then created his foundations. Our book will include a lengthier section on the whole role of Jewish philanthropy throughout the South, particularly those department store fortunes, the riches. You'll know the names. They're slipping my mind at the moment. All over the region, though, and growing from, in many cases, a tradition and religious sense of obligation to be charitable. And then I would hope we will be adding another feature in our book about, which I'm not going to get into today, but the important role that corporate philanthropy has played in the region. Now, through all this, we have continued to be the recipient of Northern philanthropy. Gates and Casey and Ford and Kellogg are still active in our region, and thank God. But the fact is that that period through the 50s, although great improvements came about, great changes were made, a lot of the South still looked very much like it had even 30 and 40 years ahead of them. I'm going to have to skip over some reference to Carnegie Corporation's support of An American Dilemma by the Swedish scholar Gunnar Myrdal. One of the most important things that philanthropy ever did in terms of calling attention to inequity in the region and in the country. But let me move ahead for now, if I may, and talk about where we seem to be today, or where we seem to have come just since the post-World War II years. Jamil Zindelman, my co-author, and I are convinced, basically, that the South's true watershed period is indeed the civil rights movement, as it is so many things. After a century's worth of efforts by African Americans to gain their constitutional rights, the 55 bus boycott in Montgomery set in motion a tide of events that could not be stopped. And again, it was Northern philanthropy that provided the significant financial underpinnings for those eventually successful fights for voting and public accommodation rights. It was those foundations that supported the historically black colleges and universities whose students were often the shock troops of the battle for racial integration. It was those foundations that made early investment in African American entrepreneurship in the rural South, with catfish farms and other ventures of that kind. Well, as the South began to change, one distinctly American form of social organization started to come into being, and that was the formation of nonprofit organizations in a much greater here in the region, occupying that essential middle ground between citizens and their government, but protecting the interests of people whose needs were not being met by the government and enhancing services where government had not yet gone. There had been a not-for-profit sector in the South prior to the Civil Rights Movement, but after 1960 it really began to take hold and continues to do so today. It had never been designed to be a strong partner, and now it had a chance. I would say those were the first real signs of the true democratization in the South. Perhaps most important, though, was the economic transformation that followed the eradication of legal segregation. Investors who had long been hesitant to enter a region characterized by lousy race relations now began to feel more comfortable about coming south. And just look at the number of national corporate headquarters that have now come to this part of the country. We are going to see a region that really, within another 20 years to 30 years, could hold half of the nation's population. It's not too far-fetched a progression or projection. That's one of the most telling affirmations of the South's change was the remigration into the region by African Americans, many of them children and grandchildren of those who had fled the South during the Reconstruction of the Jim Crow era. Today, the South is home to 1/2 of the nation's black population. So let me switch to one next slide, if we may, and talk. I forgot about that one. Is there one before that? Okay, let me stay there on the modern history, if I may, just a minute, of Southern philanthropy. During 1969, a handful of populist-minded and sometimes politically motivated congressmen, not for the first time in history, sought to force all private foundations out of existence. It was a very serious threat, and it took a lot of fighting on the part of foundations and others to save the foundation. It led to far more regulations, but although some of the more draconian features of the proposed legislation never materialized, our field found itself much more tightly regulated. In response to that, the Southeastern Council of Foundations came into being. One of the leaders of that, by the way, was the same guy who had given the money, pay my salary, to bring me south, Bill Archie, at the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation. He and both Lay Jones here at the Woodruff Foundation and John Griffin from the Education Foundation in Atlanta and a few others created the Southeastern Council of Foundations. The early growth could not match the Dukes and the Woodruffs in terms of wealth. And so for those inclined to give charitably, community foundations became an incredibly important vehicle for generosity in the region. And in 1994, Southeastern Council Board determined that we really needed to promote the growth of community foundations. And I had the privilege of being hired as an outside consultant to direct an initiative for 4 years, which turned out to be pretty successful. We doubled the number of community foundations in the South from about 60 to 120, and although that rate of growth has decelerated, it continues to this day. Last year I spent a good part of the year in Greenwood, South Carolina, helping to start another community foundation. But we got Hull Fellows from 6 community foundations this year. That's pretty par for the course. Susan Bowie, Debbie Cooper, Sarah Kinzer from the South's only statewide community foundation in Arkansas, Wesley LaRue, Wanda Moore, and Josh Phillips. And I'm told I've got 4 minutes left, and I've got to go fast. I'd like to say a lot more about the community foundations, but I haven't left enough time. I do have to mention the critical importance in the last 15, 20 years of what have come to be known health legacy foundations, created by the sale of hospitals, hospices, health management organizations. They have brought literally several billions of dollars into Southern philanthropy. Often they are the largest foundation in their communities. They have no traditions upon which they have to rely, so they have shown an uncommon amount of imagination and entrepreneurialism in doing philanthropy, and some of you represent some of those today, as you saw from the earlier slide. Well, here we are now in the early days of 2013. I want to show one last slide, and I have a moment. Oh, yeah, that one. Why have I put up this slide titled, "What's Wrong with This Picture?" It's part of a larger chart I found in last year's Chronicle of Higher Philanthropy's August edition, which listed the 100 most generous metropolitan areas in the country. And if you look at this, virtually every one of these communities in the top 25 are in the South. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, I stared at that and I thought, that's wonderful. We ought to pat ourselves on the back that Southerners are so damn generous. But every one of those Southern communities is operating in a community or metropolitan area or a state which is better known for having the absolutely lowest possible ranking for every health and education and welfare indicator having to do with the well-being of human beings in the United States. all of those states are at the absolute bottom. So generosity, make a very abrupt change to where we started, does not necessarily speak to the issue of justice. I suspect all of those places have wonderful artistic organizations, wonderful museums, historic restoration projects, but I've got to ask whether philanthropy is touching the basic needs of everyone. So very quickly, although the South has some wonderful new vibrancy as measured by its philanthropy, even though we're going to continue to grow our philanthropy, good things are going to continue to happen, we've still got some major challenges facing us. Steve said it all very well last week, but I'm going to ask you to put up the final slide, which is a wonderful quote from a book that Martin Luther King wrote called Strength of Love, basically an exegesis of the story of the Good Samaritan. But he makes the point that philanthropy is commendable, and I agree. All forms of philanthropy, whether you're putting a buck in the Salvation Army kettle or giving $20 million to your favorite university. But true philanthropy has to take note of the fact that there are circumstances of economic injustice which have made philanthropy necessary. If we were all doing well, we would not need philanthropy. And so it's a thing to keep in mind as you go through this year, discussing and pondering what your role is going to be. There's a wonderful woman who's Warren Buffett's sister in North Carolina who runs the Sunshine Lady Foundation, and she made her choice very early. She said she does not fund SOBs, symphonies, operas, or ballets. She's all about bringing about change in the lives of individuals and institutions. So I wish you well as you try to sort through this whole dilemma. I apologize for having made this crash course of philanthropy in the South come to too abrupt an end. I could have used another 20 minutes as it turns out. But thank you for your patience, and we'll look to get further information to you as we move on. Bobby?
Well, I want to thank Martin for a very informative session. David, I don't know that we have time for questions. How do you want to handle this?
Well, I think I think we've come to the end of the time. I think we probably need to respect folks' calendars, but obviously it's just so much material to cover, it's hard to contain it really. But maybe if folks, since Josh and Tristy had already volunteered to help with questions, if people do have a question they'd like to put to Martin, perhaps you could communicate with Josh and Tristy, and then they in turn could be in touch with Martin and then get back to the group with his responses. That might kind of help gather things up.
If somebody would email me those questions, David, I'll be happy to respond in writing.
That'd be great.
I can forward it to the entire group, along with Martin's slides.
Okay, good.
David,
Bobby,
that sounds great. Please send questions to myself or to Tristy or put them on the Facebook page, and we'll compile them and get them to Martin.
Yeah, that sounds great, guys.
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good day, a good week, and we look forward to reconnecting at our next webinar.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you. Please stand by.